Good morning. Our scripture passage for today is typically called the parable of the talents, and it comes to us from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who was leaving on a trip. He called his servants and handed his possessions over to them. To one he gave 5 valuable coins, often called talents. To another he gave 2, and to another he gave 1. He gave to each servant according to that servant's ability. Then he left on his journey. After the man left, the servant who had 5 valuable coins took them and went to work doing business with them. He gained 5 more. In the same way, the one who had 2 valuable coins gained 2 more. But the servant who had received the 1 valuable coin dug a hole in the ground and buried his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The one who had received 5 valuable coins came forward with 5 additional coins. He said, "Master, you gave me 5 valuable coins. Look! I've gained 5 more." His master replied, "Excellent! You are a good and faithful servant. You've become faithful over a little. I'll put you in charge of much. Come, celebrate with me." The second servant also came forward and said, "Master, you gave me 2 valuable coins. Look, I've gained 2 more." His master replied, "Well done, you are a good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I'll put you in charge of much. Come, celebrate with me." Now the one who had received 1 valuable coin came and said, "Master, I knew that you are a hard man. You harvest grain where you haven't sown. You gather crops where you haven't spread seed. So I was afraid. And I hid my valuable coin in the ground. Here, have what's yours." His master replied, "You evil and lazy servant. You knew that I harvest grain where I haven't sown, and that I gather crops where I haven't spread seed. In that case, you should have turned my money over to the bankers, so that when I returned, you could give me what belonged to me with interest. Therefore, take from him the valuable coin and give it to the one who has 10. Those who have much will receive more, and they will have more than they need. But as for those who don't have much, even the little bit they have will be taken away from them. Now, take the worthless servant and throw him out into the darkness. People there will be weeping and grinding their teeth." So I would imagine that many of you are familiar with this scripture passage. Perhaps have heard many sermons on this passage. And often that sermon was one on stewardship. Give more to the church, your reward will be greater. Well, I'm not asking you to give more to the church based on this parable. I'm not going to tell you you are either like the first 2 servants, making more money, or that you are like the third, not giving enough, and because of that you will be punished. I want to give you a different view of these 16 verses. Because for me, this parable has, like so many, been oversimplified. God is the master. If we give more, we get a better seat in heaven. But I think if we look more deeply at it, if we turn it on its head, as Jesus so often did in his stories, it becomes a different story, maybe a little hard to understand. We have a man here who evidently has a lot of money, more money than he needs. He prepares to go on a trip. But before he leaves, he doles out part of his wealth according to each person's ability. The first 2 servants take the money and create more money. Lots of money. The 5 talents given to the one was worth 75 years of wages. So servant number one now has and hands back 150 years worth of wages. I ask you, who needs that kind of money? Who would make use of that kind of money in a good way? The second slave only has 30 years worth of wages to play with, and he hands back 60. The wealthy man who already has more than enough is pleased that his money, through no effort of his own, has grown. He invites the first two to join him in his celebration of money, money, money. Does that sound like God to you? Then we have the third servant given 1 talent, 15 years worth of wages. But this servant buried it to keep it safe because he was afraid of the master. He was punished for his actions, thrown into the outer darkness, simply because he kept the money safe. He didn't grow it, but he kept it safe, buried in the ground, which was actually a common practice in those days. There were no 3 banks on every corner. You choose which one you like. So often they would take something valuable, dig a hole, and bury it. And because he was cautious with this thing of value, he was punished. Does that sound like God to you? This punishment is really hard for me to understand if we read this story and see the master as God, which is the common interpretation. For in this story, the master is a hard man, dishonest, and one should be afraid of him. Does that sound like God to you? A hard master you should be afraid of? It's not how I experience God. God who graces me in times of stress with a bit of comfort, who wraps me in tender care in times of sorrow and sits with me, who gives me courage when I am afraid. The God I know, the God I love, the God I follow, would not throw someone into the outer darkness, especially if they were afraid. So I invite you to see this story not about money or church or a God who punishes, because my hope is that you too know God to be compassionate and kind. In the story, we heard the third servant say, I was afraid. I was afraid. Does that statement lead us to see this master as God? I think not, for we know that the simple statement, fear not, is in our Bible over 300 times. God's message sent through angels and prophets and wise people. Fear not, for I am with you. Being punished for acting out of fear goes against everything we know about God. When I thought about this third slave, I thought about post-Depression era folks who put their money into a coffee can or tucked it under the mattress. My grandma was one of them. Her experiences in life of being deprived of abundance in the grocery store, failing banks, and uncertainty in the world made her hide her money and live so frugally that when she died, we laid her to rest in a brand new sweater my sister had given her the previous Christmas. She buried that sweater in a drawer because she was afraid that she would not be able to afford a new sweater if a special occasion came along. Was my grandma a bad person who should be punished because she was afraid to lose something valuable? Was the third slave a bad person who should be punished because he was afraid to risk the valuable thing that was entrusted to him? I think this story may be a bit about fear. How fear controls our actions when we have something valuable and we fear we may lose it. I do not think this story is about you giving more to the church. I think this story can teach us to be brave with something valuable. And when we are, in the end, we will be rewarded with celebration and joy. The first two servants, given much according to their abilities, perhaps bravery and confidence, were able to let go of the money and dare a little and grow it because they were not afraid of losing that valuable thing. But the third servant, maybe a little less confident, less sure, was unable to venture forth. He was afraid to lose the bit he had as a sure thing. I invite you in this context then to imagine for a moment, what is the most valuable thing in your life? For me, it's love. Paul said in his letter to the church at Corinth, "These three things abide: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love." So what if we see this tale as a tale about us and how we view one another's valuable things, and what if that thing of value is love? After all, what's the most valuable thing God gives to us? It's love. So now we see this story in light of not money, not investing, not gaining more material wealth, but instead as measures of love. And if we see it that way, we get a different story. I think this is a tale of not giving in to harsh masters of the material world, masters who reap where they do not sow, who gather where they do not plant seeds. What if in this story, Jesus is simply saying, being stingy with love, you miss out on the good stuff? After all, Jesus wasn't talking about coins or pearls or lamps when he told stories about things lost and found, things hidden and uncovered, things buried under a bushel basket. This parable ends with the third servant being thrown into the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And here again, I think we have humanity judging who is in, who is out. But Libby Howe, an assistant to an Episcopal bishop, says this: whenever the outer darkness and gnashing of teeth come up, I picture Jesus there, bringing comfort and freedom. This is a story not about judgment, not about stewardship, but about being not afraid to risk, because we know we will not be met by a harsh master, but by a God of love who asks us to dare, to be keepers of the love given to us, to be multipliers of that love. So I will leave you with a question rather than a conclusion. What will you do with the portion of love entrusted to you? Namaste.